I just started recording. Hope that's okay. There were a couple of requests for recordings of it.
See how this works. I'll share and then I'll do full screen. Oops. Hello, everyone. Maybe some of you have been in the other, this is part 3. So this is not a repeat of what I've done for part 1 and part 2. Partly it's inspired by some changes I've made to the package. I worked a little bit on the nlraa package. So the first thing, this is my outline today. How do we represent uncertainty? We're going to talk a little bit about that. And I think this is a question at least that was asked last time, is how to choose a model. There might be other better ways to choose a model. And then about other types of intervals that I'm going to be mentioning today. And perhaps, hopefully we'll have time to do some things in R if the questions come up or anything like that. So let me see, change the setting here. I don't know if you see exactly what I see or you see something different, but
I see error bars close to that slide, and then at least I'm seeing like it's captioning at the bottom.
Yeah, the captioning. I have it for class, and I guess like I don't know how to turn it off right now.
It's fine.
Yeah. So this is a paper on the GitHub for Lunchinators. I posted a couple of papers. One of the papers is called Error Bars, and they have these quotes from the paper. It says, when asked to estimate the required separation between 2 points with error bars for a difference at significance of p.05, only 22% of respondents were within a factor of 2. It says, in light of the fact that error bars are meant to help us assess the significance of the difference between 2 values, this observation is disheartening and worrisome. These are a couple of statisticians that wrote that paper in Nature Methods. So what they point out is that in many papers, we see sometimes reports of means with some error bars around them. And they did a little survey, and that survey, it's split between papers that report standard deviations, other papers report standard error of the mean, and other papers report confidence intervals. But note here that the same length of error bars that are just like slightly touching, depending on which type of error bar you're reporting, you get a different p-value. And I mentioned this because more recently, in the last few months, I've had many times interactions with colleagues that they tell me, well, the error bars are touching, so therefore things are not significant, they're not different. And that actually depends on the type of error bar you're reporting. So, in this case, the standard error of the mean, you might get away with someone thinking that there's a difference, but if you go by these p-values, they would not be. Similarly, here you have the same p-value, 0.05. This is for a sample mean of 0 and 1 and a sample size of 10. Then here you have the standard deviations, which are overlapping quite a bit. And still that would lead to a p-value of 0.05. The standard error of the means of the same sample would suggest a very large difference, but actually the p-value is the same, right? And very commonly, this is what happens in some papers. You might get something like this, where you report the confidence interval, and you might think, well, these two means are not different because the confidence intervals are overlapping. But in fact, the p-value is just the same, 0.05. So as Audrey was saying at the beginning, some people here are experts and some are experienced. I don't know how many of you maybe might have been surprised by the fact that I was showing you. And in that paper, they show for different standard error of the mean error bars, different types of p-values that you would expect. So you see in none of these cases they're overlapping, but the p-value changes. On this side, you get the equivalent confidence intervals, right? So again, the confidence intervals could be touching here, that could be overlapping this two, and still you would have a p-value of 0.01. So that's a great, that paper is a page and a half, I think, so it's good to go and read it, even if you thought you knew this, to go and review it. They have a quote. It says, in general, a gap between bars does not ensure significance, nor does overlap rule it out. It depends on the type of bar. And chances are you were surprised to learn this unintuitive result. At least in my interaction with many other people, they have been surprised by it when I send them this paper and try to explain it. So I imagine that at least someone here today is surprised. So if we extend that to regression, I'm going to start with simple linear regression, and then we can move on to nonlinear regression, the motivation. But we can have a trend line, a regression line, and I'm assuming that some of you use geom smooth, and then if you say method LM, you just fit a regression line around that. And I put some gray ribbons around it, this gray area. And you might not know, what kind of interval is that one based on what I just was telling you before. Well, that's a confidence interval for that regression line. Notice that here I didn't do it exactly, but you can simulate data where you can end up with a very similar regression line and a very similar confidence band around it, or confidence interval about that regression line. But we compare the previous slide to this slide, there's a lot more spread, but there's a lot more data. So this shows that the fact that you could end up with exactly the same regression line with exactly the same confidence bands around it, but it could be compensated. You can either have a smaller data set, but it's more precise, or a larger data set that is less precise, or it has larger residual variance. And these are the things that you would want to take into account if you're thinking about how to display the uncertainty in your data, which is what essentially what we try to do in statistics. Here I'm showing you an example that it's the same data as before, but now the code is going to look a little bit different, and you can take control of the code a little bit more that you would do with geom smooth. So what I've done here is I use LM and I fitted a linear regression with that some data. I can put the code in GitHub later, and I use the predict function. So the predict function with a linear model, you can ask for an interval or confidence interval. You can request the standard error, which is not strictly needed here, but you can ask for the standard error of the fit of the model. I arranged that into a data frame. If you wanted a tibble or something, it would be the same. And then I can display that uncertainty in terms of an error bar or error band with this geom ribbon, right? So the equivalent, so the data sets I'm using are this kind of the same, some of the same I've used before. I presented this data set in one of the previous presentations, the orange tree, because it's just a very simple example of nonlinear data. And you can use geom smooth and notice that now the bands are much wider because we're dealing with a smaller data set. And those bands are, again, confidence intervals around the regression line, right? This is the code I use for that. Like you just say geom smooth and you use it with all defaults, and notice that it's telling you it's using lowest, which is a type of local polynomial that just fits around the data, right? An alternative, as I've talked in the last 2 times, is to use other types of nonlinear regression where we have a specific shape. In this case, I fitted a logistic model, which has a specific nonlinear relationship among 3 parameters. And then what we can do, what we want to do, might want to do, and in this case, we go back to the idea I was showing you at the beginning of the standard deviations, the standard errors, and the confidence intervals, is we could either display standard errors around this regression line, this logistic model, or we could be displaying confidence intervals, 95% confidence interval for the regression line. If you remember the sort of frequentist justification for this is the idea that this samples come from some population, and if we sample many, many times, this confidence interval, 95% of those times would contain, or would contain the true nonlinear relationship between X and Y, right? So this is the code I used to make this figure. And this, as I said, one of the motivations was to show you some updates in the package. It has a function called now predict underscore NLS, which behaves in the same way as the predict function for a linear model. The difference is that predict is a generic function, and it would work on an NLS object, but it does not give you, it does not allow you to calculate confidence intervals at a specific level. It just does prediction, but it doesn't give you this uncertainty. So this makes it, this is a kind of thing that you could do it on your own, but this function is there in the package, and it helps eliminate some of that friction sometimes when we have to write a lot of code in R, we might not do it, or we might make mistakes, right? So notice what I did is I fitted this function SS logistic, and then this is all it takes to fit that nonlinear function. As I said, the predict underscore NLS is in package NLRAA. As you can see in the previous model, something that maybe doesn't quite look right is that we just fitted the model as it is. We assume that the variance is the same across the X values, but it looks like it would make more sense to have that variance depend on the size of the fitted values as it increases with the size. So we can fit a different model, which is a generalized nonlinear regression model, in which we say explicitly that the variance does increase as the fitted values increase, and then we get a regression line with uncertainty around it that makes a little bit more sense based on the shape of the data. So that's how we present uncertainty. In a simple way, we can look at a more complex way. And here I wanted to expand on the question about how to choose models, how to choose a model. And for here, I'm using the soybean example, which is a similar example I used last time. I've used both this, or they're built-in data sets in R, so that means I don't have to deal with giving you an extra data sets and so on. But they're basically examples of nonlinear relationships, and many of you might have examples of nonlinear relationships. So here we see that it has kind of an S shape, is a typical growth curve. This is the weight of some soybean plants in 2 varieties in 3 years. So there are 2 different types of varieties, and these measurements were done in 2 different years. And each one of these there's a column in the data set that identifies a specific plot. Last time, I fitted a nonlinear mixed model to that data, and that has an asymptote, breakpoint, point in the middle, an inflection point, and a scale which controls the spread of that S shape. And the B1, B2, and B3 are random effects, which are assumed to have a mean of 0 and some covariance matrix, which last time I spent some time talking about how to model different ways in which we can model this covariance matrix. But this is basically a nonlinear mixed model. And the identification, the I here, would be at the individual plot. Like in other cases, this individual plot might be an individual animal or an individual person that you're tracking, or some other kind of experimental unit. So let's say a priori, we want to state a number of models as being different models that you might be competing with each other. We could have a 5-degree polynomial, just because that S shape kind of looks tricky. We could have that logistic model that I just mentioned, and there are other types of growth models that can be reasonable models in this case. One is called the Gompertz model. Another one is called Weibull. There's another one I introduced last time, Beta. And we can also try splines, which are one type of models that are within the generalized additive models. So here I'm going to show you, this is the fit and the uncertainty that's in the package too. And it provides you, there's equivalent functions to just simply be able to display that uncertainty for the 5-degree polynomial, which is essentially a linear model, not a non-linear model. Let's see. This is the same figure. Oh, yeah, there's the code. That's what I was missing. So the code shows that this FMP is an object that I just fitted a linear mixed effects model with a 5-degree polynomial. And then how do I get this error bars? I use the predict underscore nlme as it takes a lot of different kinds of objects, among them an LME object. And this P level is a prediction level. 0 would be at the level of variety, averaging over years. And if I say P level 1, I would be asking for a prediction at the level of an individual year, which here I included as a random effect. So I have year as a random effect, and then plot within year as another level of random effect. So this is a fit from the logistic model. It's a nonlinear mixed effects model. Notice that the uncertainty around the regression line increases, but I actually didn't model that explicitly. That is built into the structure of the model. These error bars are produced from simulation from the fitted model. So some parameters have more uncertainty than others. And when you take all the uncertainty into account, you naturally end up with these error bars or error bands. We can look at the Gompertz model. It's similar. It looks like the error bars might be a little bit larger. So perhaps it could be a model that fits this data a little bit, not quite as well. We can have the Weibull model, and this model has 4 parameters instead of 3 as the previous models. And notice that the error bars are huge, right? And I do work with nonlinear models quite a bit. And in some cases, I fitted models that they looked like they were fine. And we carried on and we did the analysis. And typically in the past, it wasn't that common to include these error bars around it because you have to do a lot of work to get them. So the package now makes it really easy. You just use that predict underscore and LME function, and you just get the error bars without too much work. But it shows us there's something wrong with this model. And this model could be fixed. I didn't attempt to fix it, but could be fixed by simplifying the model, by eliminating some of the terms, or sometimes it indicates that the model is over-parameterized, because clearly the error bars here are too big for the data. So it shows that this model is inappropriate in some sense. Since here we have competing models, we might just discard it, but I wanted to show you this, that the error bars can be a tool for diagnosing typically models that are over-parameterized. And if you didn't have the error bars, if you just had the lines, you might have not noticed that. This is the beta model, which is similar to the logistic one, but it has a bit of a different structure, and it has parameters that are nice to interpret because they give you the time point at which you reach the highest amount of biomass, and then kind of a middle point, the value of that higher biomass, and a middle point between those two that can be controlled. The point at which you reach half of the maximum biomass, in other words. And here I fitted a GAM, a spline model. There's different amount of effort you can do to fit different types of GAMs. And here I put a relatively small amount of effort because GAMs are not superior to some of the other models in this case. And I mentioned this because I think GAMs or splines, different types of splines, I see in a lot of circles, they're thought of to be the sort of default or the perfect solution to the nonlinear model. With data sets like this, GAMs are not the best choice. And I'll show you why that's the case. They're convenient and they're easy to fit, and they don't require you to make assumptions about a lot of times the shape of that curve. And the other models exploit making the assumptions they make about the shape of that curve. So there's a function here called IC, or information criteria underscore tab, a table. There's a very similar function in the package by Ben Volker, BBMLE. Without the underscore, he has an information criteria table. But what it does is we can provide it with a lot of different models. The P is a polynomial model, L3 is a logistic, this is the Gompertz, Weibull, Beta, and the GAMS model here. And it organizes the models by how well they fit the data. I was hoping maybe to have an example where the models would be closer to each other. But basically you get the AIC. We can sort the models by AIC, by this corrected AIC for small sample sizes, for the BIC. These are information criteria, which basically the smaller the value, the better the model. And it penalizes both the fit, like how well the model fits the data, like given the amount of error it has, and the number of parameters. So here the GAM model, because of the way I fit it, has like 71 parameters. So it fits a lot of, it puts in a lot of parameters. It's not the worst model, but it's not the best one. Based on the difference in one of these information criteria, here I chose AIC, between models, you can assign weights to different models. As I said, it would have been fun to have an example. I have other data sets that the models, there's not one clear winner. And it's fun because you can compute the prediction from those models in a weighted fashion. So you don't have to pick one winner. You just have 3 competing models, and you can have them, weight by the difference in the AIC between the best one, the second best, and the third best, and so on. Here are the weights, because the difference is 46 here between the first and the second model. Almost all the weight is given to the beta model, the beta growth function model, which, when we were looking at them visually, it wasn't so obvious that the beta growth model was so much better than the other ones, but that's what the AIC says. So let's see. Here, there's something. I lost my mouse.
That happened to me while teaching the other day. It was very frustrating.
Yeah. Let's see. I have to get out and get back in because it's not responding, PowerPoint. I don't know. Let's see. You still see, right? PowerPoint?
Yeah, there's a question for you also in the chat when you have a chance.
Okay, yeah, we should have time, I hope, cool. When I'm done. Let's see. Okay, so this idea that I'm showing you there very shortly is, I mentioned this in case you were not familiar. If you find yourself in a situation where you have some data and a number of different competing models, and you don't think that choosing one model is the best strategy, there's something called multimodal inference or model selection. Or yes, you can use AIC or BIC to pick one winner, or you can actually apply weights to the different models and use those weights to compute things like predictions from an average model. So here I'm showing you that that function predict underscore NLME can take a bunch of models. So you can provide it with a lot of different models and ask for the confidence interval of the average model. In this case, it's not the best example because the beta model is so much better than the rest one. Than picking the beta or doing an average based on weights is the same thing. So there are other types of intervals. I think I should be done in a few minutes. So there are other types of intervals which I haven't mentioned yet. You know, we talked about confidence intervals. We talked about you can put in the standard deviation or you can put the standard error of the mean. So here I'm introducing one type of additional interval, which is the prediction interval. So notice here I'm giving you an example where you have some treatment and some control. We have two distributions. And we have the confidence intervals. As we saw earlier, those confidence intervals could be overlapping, but the black dot with the error bars is the difference between the two distributions. And you notice how the interval doesn't include zero. So the two distributions have means that are different, but prediction intervals are, instead of a statement about the mean of those distributions, more about a statement about the distribution itself. So if you think about this, could be some individuals in a distribution, there could be a lot of overlap. You know, you could think examples like this one could be, you know, the height, say between, you know, men and women, right? And, you know, men are not trying to be sexist here or anything, but men tend to be a little bit taller than women. But in the population at large, there's a lot of discrepancy. There's a lot of short men, a lot of tall women, and everything in between. So if you display those prediction intervals, there would be a substantial amount of overlap. There's something called also tolerance intervals, which there are on a paper I posted on GitHub, but I'm not going to talk about those today. So if we go back to that orange data set and we put in prediction intervals, this is a small data set, so that's a bit of a problem, but you can use the code I had. Instead of asking for a confidence interval, you ask for a prediction interval, and you get these huge intervals that, given the small data set, they look like they're too wide, but that often happens with prediction intervals. And then you get the standard error, that particular difference. And here, notice the difference is I asked for a prediction interval, and since it's based on simulation, I increase the simulations to 3,000 instead of the default of 1,000. Here I have, for other updates about the package, you can check out the vignettes if you download the package. There's a few other things there. But I think with that, I can stop. Let's see, I can look at, if I can go and look at the question again in the chat. So the question is from Marin. So basically, you can combine nonlinear models the same way you would combine machine learning models and ensemble learning. Yes, so this is one way of doing model averaging. There's a term here, ensemble, and sometimes this is used, and there are many publications in which, in particular, you know, one case where I think they have gained a lot of I don't know, reputation is in the climate models. Sometimes they have a lot of different climate models that they use for prediction, and they report ensembles of those models because each model is assumed to have a specific bias, a specific problem. So the idea is that the average of the models is better than any one model itself. So maybe when, I think you just volunteered to present, you could be presenting on some machine learning examples where you combine machine learning methods. We could go, we could open it up for questions now. I think I had another slide.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks. I will start by saying like that it's useful to know about that paper because they mentioned in the beginning that I feel like is an argument that or in a discussion that I've had many times and or been part of, or and yeah, it's just useful to know there's a short paper that can when
yeah.
The error bars aren't overlapping that you can refer
to. I feel like this is I mean I don't know if this is the advice that when you want to make a statement about two things being different, plot the standard error of the means, and reviewers won't say anything if they're not touching, if they're not overlapping, even if the p-value is 0.15.
Yeah.
And then the opposite can be true, but I think the point here is try to represent uncertainty in the most honest way. Ken is asking the reference. I'll send you, Ken, the paper directly to you, but it's on GitHub. I posted it on GitHub, the error bars paper, and there's another paper about prediction intervals.
If any of you aren't on the GitHub yet, let me know and I can add you to it. Just message me in the chat your GitHub username or your email, and I will send you an invite to it.
And the corollary to what Fernando was just saying is, yes, you should plot some form of error bars when in a graph, but tell your readers which form of error bars you're plotting. I get incredibly frustrated when somebody says mean with error bars. And they don't tell you whether it is a standard error of a mean, plus or minus 1, a 95% confidence interval. And as Fernando pointed out, it makes quite a difference in interpreting it. If you really, really, really want to use those error bars to indicate differences between means, there are ways of fudging. It's not 95% confidence interval, and it's less than 95% confidence. So you can work through the math to get bars that are the equivalent of what in the old days used to be a least significant difference bar that would be added up in the top corner of a plot, where you compare the difference between means to the length of that LSD bar. That's fallen. I don't see that being used nearly as much as you saw it 20 years ago. And the other comment, model averaging is a really powerful tool for integrating information over a bunch of models. There are a couple of subtle issues that we can talk about, basically having to do with the weights attached to a model are actually estimated from the data. They're not fixed in advance, which changes a lot of the way you should think about weighting different answers. But the more important point is, if you're doing model averaging, you really, really have to model average something which is equally interpretable in all the models you're working with. So predictions at a particular age, for example, looking at the orange tree data, predicted circumference at a particular age is a great example of something you can model average. Regression coefficients in, for example, a variety of different multiple regression models are not something you should be model averaging.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one trick here, is that the coefficients from the beta and the logistic and the Gompertz and the Weibull, they're not equivalent. So you can, they're very different types of coefficients. So you would not want to do sort of this model averaging over any one particular coefficient. Many of those might have the asymptote that might be equal, and a parameter with an equal, a similar interpretation. But what I've done here is just do model averaging for prediction only. And part of it, this was motivated by, I've read papers recently, in the last few months, when they do try to argue whether one model is better than the other one in some simple nonlinear regressions. And you know, different scientists like pick different models based on more or less arbitrary arguments. So, and I haven't seen this model averaging used in that context, in a specific context. So, and I think, Haldra, last time you did ask me, or others ask, you know, what, you know, how do you choose models? You know, what if you have two models that are almost equally good, right? And this would be, could be potentially a solution. You could have two models that are almost equally good, and then you just like fit both of them, and you can weight them by this weights that are derived from the AIC or BIC or AIC corrected. And this is, you know, there's a whole book written about it, and I can post another paper on GitHub there that goes into a lot of details. So this is almost like a total subdiscipline of statistical ecology, the model averaging, which I'm sure, you know, Philip knows about. That paper made it popular. The book I was just mentioning made it popular.
Can you explain? I feel like I'm not sure that I fully understand how you're combining these very different types of models in the to get an average, and then combine and the standard error. Like what is actually happening in that step?
Oh yeah. So well, maybe see if I go back. So, so this is the example of weights. Unfortunately here, you know, the weights it's all in the beta, the FMB3 model. Let's pretend that there was a bit more of an even distribution of weights among these models. What you do is, for the prediction at any one point across that sort of X value, you calculate the prediction according to the polynomial model, according to the logistic model, according to the Gompertz model, the Weibull, the beta, the gamma, and each one of those, you multiply them by their weight and you add them up. So it's a weighted average of the predictions of each model. Here, the beta gets all the weight, but in other examples, you would get a little bit more the distribution among the different models. So it's a very simple weighted average. We just multiply the prediction of each model. And I've seen in other cases where, you know, each model, when you look at it now more in detail, it's clear that each model has its own kind of type of bias. And when you average them, you get sometimes a more smooth description of the data.
That makes sense. And so, it makes sense doing it over the predicted values, but and it sounds like what you were saying, Philip, is you can't just average, like if you have a bunch of models that are the same, or you can't just average a coefficients, like that is where you run into problems. Whereas here you're making predictions and then averaging the predictions. Is that right?
That's right. You've just got to think, there's been a trend in multiple regression modeling. Instead of, as Fernando says, instead of trying to pick the best fitting model and then interpreting that, to then fit a variety of models and average the coefficients. And Brian Cade, who's in Denver, has written a paper in Ecology a couple of years ago, pointing out some of the problems with doing that, which has to do with, although it might be a coefficient for height in a regression model, that has a different interpretation depending on which other variables are in the model. That's basically the issue. And I should point out, the the nice thing about model averaging is that you can actually do a reasonably honest uncertainty, standard error for that model averaged coefficient, which incorporates two sources of uncertainty, the uncertainty within each model, and also the heterogeneity between the different model results, different model values. So if all your models give you very similar results, you're basically averaging a bunch of models. And if they give you very, very different results, that heterogeneity gets incorporated into the overall uncertainty.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and Haldra, I think your other question is sort of how is this done? And what I'm doing here is I'm simulating data, like a forward simulation from each individual model, and that's how I end up with those uncertainty bands or error bars.
That makes sense.
Around it.
Yeah.
So there's an alternative that I talked about last time, which is bootstrapping, but I found out in some problems, like sometimes fitting nonlinear models with complex ones can take a while, and a lot of times it doesn't converge. So it turns out that getting bootstrap confidence intervals for predictions could take 10 hours for a model.
Mm-hmm.
And this method it takes a couple of seconds only. So if you really wanted to do bootstrap to get uncertainty, you could, but it could potentially take a long time. So maybe not every problem deserves that kind of effort.
So is what you called forward simulation what other people call parametric bootstraps?
Yes. So in the package, I added simulate functions, which behave a little bit different from some of the R built-in simulation functions. I can show them in a second. Because one of the things, I don't know, Philip, what you think about this, I think is interesting, but the simulate function in R, let's see, I'm going to share a screen. I'm going to share R. The simulate function in R for linear models. So you can see this function simulates only observations taking into account the residual uncertainty, but not the uncertainty in the mean or in the mean function of the model. But simulate is a generic method, and a lot of different models or functions in R have their own kind of simulation method. So what I have in the package are this simulate for GAM, for GLS, GNLS, LM, LME, NLME, and NLS. So using this simulate functions in my package, I simulate data from the models, and then you summarize those simulation results. But the LM, for example, method is different from the generic method for LM in a number of ways. One is that it can produce what are called wild residuals. It's not that important. But the other one is that it can simulate data in different ways. And one of those ways takes into account the uncertainty in the mean and in the residual sampling. And I think so 0 returns the fitted values. 1 simulates from the beta vector, the mean response. Simulates from the beta vector and adds resampled residuals. And this one also considers uncertainty in the variance covariance matrix of beta and adds residuals. So it looks more like prediction. But simulate LM and R only takes the fitted, the beta, the estimate of the parameter estimates, and adds some resample normal residuals. So that's how it's kind of different.
Any other questions from anyone? Any volunteers for next week? Do you know someone that might have some data that you want them to present? Also, as I said in the beginning, if any of you have a topic that you would like to hear more on, definitely let me know about that too, because I think there's a lot of people who might be willing to present, they just aren't sure what to present on. So definitely reach out for that. Thanks so much, Fernando. That was great. That was really, really helpful and yeah, really interesting to see.
Yeah, I know it was, it was about nonlinear models, but I try to present a couple of things that I thought would be of general interest. One is this error bars that, is there any student that thought they were confused about it, just like go and reread the paper and have it completely clear. And the other one is this multimodel inference, which doesn't only apply to nonlinear models, it applies to other areas, but maybe was a concept that they have not heard about and could be interesting.
Yeah, it was both really helpful. Thanks so much. And then I added, so those papers are on GitHub. Let me know if anyone needs to get added to GitHub. And yeah, thanks everyone. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It looks like, Fernando, that Tanya, who's still on here, has said she's going to try this with her data and in the chat. So if you're looking for a data set for a future thing, maybe.
So Tanya, you might have a data set that she's still on, that you would be like this, one of these ideas would be useful for. So
Yeah. So cool. I got to run to another meeting, but thanks so much.
Sure. Yeah. Bye.
I'll see you later.